Hello, this is BBC World News Today with me, Karen Giannoni. A ceasefire has been agreed in Aleppo. The announcement comes as the United Nations accuses Syrian government forces of killing civilians as they drive out rebels. Tens of thousands have managed to escape the fighting, but there is growing concern for those left behind.
We have collectively failed the people of Syria. History will not easily absolve us.
In other news, Trump plumps for Rex Tillerson to steer his foreign policy as his choice for Secretary of State. Russia welcomes the oil executive's nomination. Also coming up, a Tunisian man's been found guilty of causing a boat sinking that killed 700 migrants. And all aboard if you're sleeping rough. Could this be the revolutionary answer to the problem of housing the homeless? Well, in the last hour, it's been confirmed that a ceasefire has been agreed in Syria's largest city, Aleppo. The deal comes as advancing Syrian government troops appeared poised to capture the last rebel enclave in the east of the city. Now, it's not clear yet exactly what's involved. Russia says the ceasefire only covers the evacuation of trapped fighters, but rebel sources say it was also meant to let thousands of civilians get out. The United Nations has warned that in the final battle for control, civilians are being massacred. Now, this is strongly denied by Syria's key ally, Russia. The Defense Ministry in Moscow said the successful operation by Syrian forces has been entirely humane in its treatment of the civilian population. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, reports, and you may find some of these images distressing.
Exodus. Life here is gone, destroyed in the most brutal of battles. The little they still own, they carry as they flee, heading who knows where. People too old, too ill, far too small to embark on this most frightening of journeys out of East Aleppo. May God help us and protect us, says this man. May he save our country. More terrifying still, to be trapped in this last hellish corner still held by the rebels. These scenes were filmed on a mobile phone after a Syrian army attack, most too gruesome to show. There's been, says the UN, a complete meltdown of humanity.
They are satisfied that we are being killed, that we are facing one of the most difficult or the most serious or the most horrible massacre that is in the new history.
In these last hours of battle, every day brings new reports of atrocities committed by all sides. But with the rebels cornered, human rights groups accuse the Syrian army and its allies of the worst of abuses.
We've been receiving multiple reports of some of the most appalling atrocities, if proven to be true, of civilians, including children, being executed.
As Syrian soldiers advance into one neighborhood after another, they speak of liberating these areas. But today came a charge that 82 people were shot dead in cold blood by pro-government forces. The Syrian military denies it all.
These reports are totally baseless and untrue. The Syrian Arab army would never do such things. In reality, the army is helping to secure the evacuation of civilians. The army is also helping to secure the departure of any fighters who surrender. This is an attempt to tarnish the image of the Syrian army after its victory.
And what a victory. Even the historic heart of the city is back in the government's hands. The rebels, some linked to the West and others to Al-Qaeda, are now squeezed into a few neighborhoods. A moment for President Assad's supporters to celebrate. They hail it as a victory over terrorism. For many, there's relief. A brutal battle for this city is drawing to a close. But so much has been lost. and so much of Syria is still at war.
Well, we can talk to Lise now. She's in Beirut. Lise, you were only just in Aleppo. What more do we know about this ceasefire?
Very important deal to allow the remaining rebel fighters to leave. They have been trying to come to a deal for many, many days now. We first heard of it when we were in Aleppo, that the Russians had opened up talks with the rebel groups, and it always collapsed. They never were able to agree on where the rebels would go, whether they would be able to carry weapons. And only within the last few hours does it seem that there is at last a deal. It will take place at 5 a.m. tomorrow Syrian time. That's 3 o'clock in the morning GMT. We understand from some of the rebel commanders that they will go to Idlib in the northwest, which is under rebel control. And then from there, some of them may choose to go north to the countryside, to area where there are Kurdish fighters and also Turkish forces. We understand that the fighters can also take their families with them, but it's understood that the other civilians will remain there in what's left of their homes as the battle, this biggest of battles for the biggest of cities in Syria, comes to an end.
And Lise, how does what's happening, what we're seeing going on in Aleppo, affect the war in Syria as a whole?
It doesn't end the war. It's certainly a turning point. It's the most significant victory for President Assad's forces on the battlefield. It matters symbolically and it matters strategically. And it certainly it marks a very significant defeat for the opposition. At one point over the past 4 years, they seemed to have all of the city in their sights. One of the commanders of the pro-government militia told me when I was in Aleppo that the rebels had reduced them even to 3 streets. They were reduced to bartering for food and fuel with the rebel fighters. It's an extraordinary turnaround, and much of it comes down to the intervention in September 2015 by Russia, coming to the aid of its ally in Syria and turning the tide, along with support from an array of militias. A lot of the momentum has been taken out of the opposition, but look at what happened south in recent days. The so-called Islamic State recaptured the city of Palmyra, including the Roman ruins. There's still fighting going on in Idlib. There are scattered pockets of opposition, and they will certainly not give up the fight.
Lise, thanks very much. Lise Doucet in Beirut. Well, opening an emergency session of the UN Security Council to discuss Syria, Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said the Council had failed to protect the people of eastern Aleppo from carnage.
The Security Council has failed to adopt 3 resolutions that could have enabled a humanitarian truce, evacuation of civilians, and the entry of life-saving aid. I have said before that we have collectively failed the people of Syria. The Security Council has not exercised its preeminent responsibility with regard to the maintenance of international peace and security. History will not easily absolve us.
Ban Ki-moon. Well, Nick Finney, Country Director of Save the Children in northwest Syria, joins us now from Antakya in southern Turkey. Nick Finney, welcome. What's your reaction, first of all, to the news of a ceasefire?
Of course, we welcome any progress on a ceasefire. At the moment, we're still waiting for reports to really come in and be verified as to exactly what's happening on the ground. It's too early to say how long this can last and what it can solve, but of course we welcome any respite in the fighting and any safe corridor for people who want to escape eastern Aleppo unhindered. We would view the ceasefire as a welcome yet fragile development.
And in the appalling conditions that we've heard so much about over recent weeks and months, what have you, as Save the Children, actually been able to do?
Within eastern Aleppo, during the recent months when the city has been besieged, we've continued to deliver work with our partners in eastern Aleppo to deliver education for children, to deliver food rations for people who don't have enough to eat. Now, this has continued until very recently. The situation has become so severe that these activities can no longer continue. And actually, at this point in time, we are in a situation where, from Save the Children's perspective, 300 partner staff who live in Eastern Aleppo. These are ambulance workers, these are doctors, these are teachers, these are humanitarian aid workers, are stuck in the remaining part of Eastern Aleppo. And we're very anxious as to, along with the rest of the civilians in Eastern Aleppo, as to their safety, their welfare, as they face the prospect of continued attacks, bombardment, and other measures.
And do you get a clear idea from those partners, from those staff, of just how many civilians are actually inside?
It's very hard to make an accurate estimate, but there are large numbers of civilians still remaining, including men, women, children, humanitarian workers, civilians who should be protected and who to date the international community has failed to protect. So we really hope this new development in terms of the ceasefire to allow safe passage out of the city can prevail and can be sustained to allow civilians to leave Eastern Aleppo and to receive humanitarian aid. 1 in 40 of the people coming out of Eastern Aleppo currently, they have an acute medical condition. They need urgent medical treatment. And many others have other urgent needs for humanitarian aid in terms of food, in terms of warm clothing. It's very cold at the moment, and in terms of water. So there's a lot to be done here, and we hope that this new development, the ceasefire, can provide some hope to the people that remain in the east of the city.
Nick Tilley, thank you very much from Save the Children, joining us from Turkey. Now, Donald Trump has announced his choice for Secretary of State, a Texan oil executive with no previous government experience. His name, Rex Tillerson. He's head of ExxonMobil, a company he's worked for 41 years. He's dealt with many international leaders during his career, among them Vladimir Putin, who in 2012 awarded Mr. Tillerson the Order of Friendship. From Washington, here's Barbara Pletasher.
Donald Trump's pick for Secretary of State is a Texas oil executive with no government experience. Rex Tillerson has spent his entire career at ExxonMobil, working his way up the ranks to lead the world's largest energy company. In that role, he has had a lot of face time with international leaders, negotiating high-stakes commercial ventures, nowhere more so than in Russia. His appointment is the clearest sign that Donald Trump plans to approach foreign policy like a business, sending out his top diplomat to get the best deals for America.
He knows many of the players, and he knows them well. He does massive deals in Russia. He does massive deals for the company, not for himself, for the company.
This is the last act in the most extensive drama of the transition. It came to look like a version of Celebrity Apprentice.
You're fired.
With a rotating cast of front-runners, loyal supporters, and seasoned political actors auditioned for the role. All got the thumbs down.
You're fired.
The most gripping episode involved Mr. Trump's harshest critic, the former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. He thought he might stage a comeback, but failed to make the cut. Little is known about the foreign policy positions of the successful candidate, but he'll have to hit the ground running on major issues, such as battling the Islamic State group and managing the war in Syria. Then, tensions with China, especially over trade, which Donald Trump has stirred up. There's the threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons, and the nuclear deal with Iran. Mr. Trump wants to renegotiate it. He also wants to reset relations with Russia. For that, Rex Tillerson is well placed. He's been Exxon's man in Russia for 2 decades, negotiated joint ventures, even received the country's highest honor for a foreigner. But one of the largest contracts, to drill for oil in the Arctic Ocean, was frozen by sanctions over Crimea. He said sanctions like that don't work. So the oil man will face tough confirmation hearings from senators. They're alarmed by renewed allegations of Russian hackers meddling in the election and worried by Mr. Trump's admiration for President Vladimir Putin.
Rex Tillerson knows Russia, can be an asset, but I think the broader context is it's worth the attempt. But I think that over time, Mr. Trump is going to find this relationship to be as difficult as his predecessors did.
Rex Tillerson will be navigating the world for a president who seems ready to ditch delicate diplomacy and upend traditional relationships in pursuit of what he calls a better deal. But the bottom line is that it's often outside factors which determine U.S. foreign policy, and the real test could come from reacting to crises as much as shaping events. Barbara Flatt-Usher, BBC News, Washington.
Well, I'm joined by David Sirota, who's investigations editor for the International Business Times. David Sirota, welcome. Tell us, first of all, what you learned about Rex Tillerson in the course of your investigations.
Well, we've looked into what ExxonMobil has been lobbying the department that Rex Tillerson would ostensibly be heading, the State Department, assuming he gets confirmed. And Exxon has an extensive lobbying record in terms of pressing the State Department for specific policies. It has been very active in lobbying the State Department on trade issues, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that trade deal which Donald Trump says he opposes. It has specifically lobbied on provisions in trade deals that critics say allow corporations to sue sovereign governments to try to overturn their domestic public interest laws, environmental laws, labor laws, and the like. The lobbying records also show that under Rex Tillerson, Exxon has lobbied the State Department on issues like sanctions against Iran and Russia, and obviously that dovetails with questions about how close Rex Tillerson is with the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin. So Exxon has a deep interests at the State Department that Rex Tillerson will be leading, and one other I should include is offshore ocean-based drilling. Very recently, Exxon was lobbying the State Department on a proposed treaty governing ocean-based drilling. Exxon also lobbied the State Department on a treaty between the United States, a successfully signed treaty between the United States and Mexico that has opened up or could potentially open up large swaths of the Gulf of Mexico.
Given everything you
say,
say,
so there's a lot
David,
of overlap.
Sorry to interrupt. Given all of this, how much of a problem do you think this is going to be? You used the term, assuming he gets confirmed. How much of this will be a problem in those confirmation hearings?
Well, look, I certainly think conflicts of interest are going to be asked about at those hearings, whether Tillerson has a conflict of interest in terms of his own personal holdings in ExxonMobil and how he could conduct being an impartial Secretary of State while having such deep ties to the company. And then obviously there's this issue with his relationship with Russia. I mean, he has said himself that he is very close with Vladimir Putin. And so I think that we've already seen Democrats raising questions about whether he can be an effective representative of the United States when he has such deep ties to a foreign power. Will he get confirmed? It's hard to know. One thing we do know is that Exxon is an extremely powerful, politically connected company in the United States Congress. And I think that power is going to play a role, at least some role, in those confirmation hearings.
One very, very brief answer, if I may ask that. Is there going to be a problem that the most important diplomat in the US has no official formal diplomatic experience?
I certainly think experience is going to be a big part of this, although I think Donald Trump has already argued this, and Rex Tillerson will argue that his role leading a major corporation in other countries has allowed him to experience what it takes to close deals. Whether that means diplomatic experience, that's a different question, and I think that'll be asked about.
David Sirota, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much joining us from Denver.
Thank you.
Now a look at some of the day's other news stories. Several West African heads of state are trying to negotiate a political solution following the disputed presidential election in the Gambia. The country's current president, Yahya Jammeh, has rejected the result of the election after rival Adama Barrow was declared the winner earlier this month. Meanwhile, troops loyal to President Jammeh have reportedly taken control of Gambia's electoral commission. The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has accused America of violating the nuclear deal agreed last year and has ordered scientists to develop nuclear-powered marine vessels. Tehran says the US breached the existing deal when Congress voted to extend sanctions against Iran. Under the nuclear deal, Iran isn't allowed to enrich uranium above an agreed purity level. The captain of a ship which sank last year in the Mediterranean with hundreds of migrants on board, has been jailed for 18 years. An estimated 700 people died. Mohammed Ali Melek was in charge despite barely knowing how to steer a ship. This happened in April 2015. The boat left Libya. Its destination was the Italian island of Lampedusa, but it ran into trouble. It issued a distress call and the captain crashed his boat into a ship answering that distress call. For that, he's been found guilty of several crimes. The BBC's James Reynolds.
In April 2015, off the coast of Libya, smugglers jammed more than 700 migrants on board this fishing boat. It is astonishing to think that more than 700 human beings could be put on board this boat and then sent into the Mediterranean. And smugglers took more than $1,600 from each person, so they made about $1 million from putting people on board this boat. And the helmsman, Mohammed Ali Melek, set sail north towards Italy. When he reached international waters, he made a distress call, and a nearby Portuguese container ship was sent to help. At that point, Mohammed Ali Melek's inexperience at sea began to show, and it was to have fatal consequences. From what we understand, he steered this ship towards the container ship. The two collided, and then this vessel began to overturn. Hundreds of panicked migrants simply didn't have a chance. And the ship sank within about 5 minutes, and almost everybody on board drowned. Mohammed Ali Melek was one of only 28 survivors, and now a court here in Sicily has found him guilty of steering these migrants towards their deaths, of manslaughter, of human trafficking, and of irresponsible sailing. And earlier this year, Italy's Navy rescued this ship, and it now stands here in Sicily as a monument to the dead.
James Reynolds reporting there. Well, let's talk about what's going on in Syria. In the UK, members of Parliament have been holding an emergency debate on the plight of civilians in Aleppo. The former Chancellor George Osborne told MPs the situation could have been different if Britain had taken another course of action.
The tragedy in Aleppo did not come out of a vacuum. It was created by a vacuum of Western leadership, of American leadership, British leadership. I take responsibility as someone who sat on the National Security Council throughout those years. Parliament should take its responsibility because of what it prevented being done. And there were multiple opportunities to intervene.
George Osborne, well, British Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell was behind that emergency debate. We can talk to him now in central London. Andrew Mitchell, first of all, your reaction to that news of a ceasefire in Aleppo?
Well, it's very welcome, but of course we have to ensure that the doctors, some of the wounded children, others who need urgent medical treatment, that they too are able to move to the north to camp facilities, because there's no facilities left in Aleppo. And we need to ensure that there are independent international humanitarian workers and support inside Aleppo now, not only to provide the urgently needed medical care and food, but also to be eyes on the ground to ensure that the human rights and international humanitarian law are respected.
Today in that debate, you said that Britain is complicit in the suffering faced by civilians in Aleppo. I mean, many might say impotent, maybe, but complicit, why?
Because the international community, with much fanfare some 10 years ago, embraced a responsibility to protect R2P, which said that we would intervene in cases of grotesque abuse of human rights and of the sort of things that are happening in Aleppo. And at the first serious test following the responsibility to protect, we have lamentably failed. And I think the whole international community who signed up to that doctrine, who said never again to Srebrenica, to Rwanda, to Darfur, have been found lacking in the moral courage to intervene and to stop innocent people being slaughtered. And I think complicit was the right word. And of course, we were also complicit in the way set out by George Osborne, the former Chancellor in Britain, who made the point that there were a whole series of opportunities crystallised by August 2013, when Parliament could have agreed with the government that we should take action to protect people, and of course we failed to do so.
You also told Parliament today that you hope that the US would lift its ban on President Assad of Syria being part of any negotiations. I mean, some would say that the cruelty, including Prime Minister today, the cruelty, the massacres, the allegations of war crimes would put him as part of the problem, not the solution in the future.
Well, you know, he is part of the problem, and therefore, by definition, he is part of the solution. And we can't magic him away.
Even if he's been accused of war crimes.
Absolutely, and he must be held to account for that. But I think that it is inconceivable that the negotiations will work if Assad is excluded from them. And even the Syrian opposition accept that he should be there for the first 6 months. And of course, the reason why the original UN plan put forward by Kofi Annan failed was because of American and indeed British refusal to accept Assad being at the peace talks.
Andrew Mitchell, we must leave it there. Thank you very much joining us from central London. Well, let's just update you on what we brought you at the start of the programme, because in the last hour or so, a deal has been agreed for Syrian rebel fighters to leave enclaves they still hold in eastern Aleppo. Thanks very much for watching BBC World News Today.